Have you ever stood in a cemetery and felt like something was watching from behind the headstones? Tonight's stories don't come from campfire legends or ghost tours. They come from real footage, real moments, real horror, from shadowy figures moving behind tombstones to strange voices caught at midnight. These are true cemetery horror videos that were never meant to be explained. If you're brave enough to make it through all 10, hit that like button. It helps this video reach more horror lovers like you. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every viewer is part of my horror family, and I want to know where my family is tuning in from tonight. Let me know which story chilled you the most. And don't forget to subscribe. Your support keeps creepy souls alive, even when the dead don't stay in their graves. Now let's begin. I don't know what exactly drew me up that way, into the hollow behind War Creek, where the mountains fold into each other like heavy, damp blankets. Maybe curiosity, maybe something else. I had been running a small channel where I posted footage of forgotten places, old barns, half-collapsed schools, cemeteries tucked into ridges where the families who laid the stones had long since vanished themselves. That night was different. I drove alone, along a road I almost regretted taking the moment my tires left the blacktop. Gravel snapped under the wheels, then mud pulled at the car as the rain turned steady. The beam of my headlights caught only mist and trees. The air smelled of wet pine and something faintly metallic, like rust or rot. The cemetery wasn't marked on any map. I'd heard about it from a man in a gas station in Harlan County, who mentioned the old Morris field like it was a dare. Said there were stones scattered along a ridge, some so old the names were worn smooth. By the time I parked, the fog had settled so thick it seemed to muffle sound. The forest felt heavy, hushed. My camera strap dug into my neck as I started up the slope. Leaves were slick underfoot, and every step made the mud suck at my boots. When I reached the ridge, I saw them crooked headstones, some leaning, some nearly swallowed by ground cover. There was no order to them, just scattered markers, like the people had been buried where they fell. Moss clung to the names. I could smell the wet limestone, and the faint, sour odor of earth turned too many times. I set the camera rolling, narrating softly. My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. Here's one that just says infant, 1901. The stone was no taller than my shin. I panned the light across the others. Some had photographs sealed under glass, though the faces inside had clouded with moisture, leaving only pale smudges behind. The further I walked, the stranger it felt. The stones weren't aligned toward anything, not east, like most cemeteries. Some even faced into the woods. I crouched by one marker, where the name had been half chiseled out, as though someone tried to erase it years ago. My camera picked up details I hadn't noticed. Odd grooves in the dirt, like someone had dragged something heavy across it not long ago. That was when I saw it. As I panned the camera across the ridge, the screen caught a faint figure, a person, leaning against a headstone about 30 yards away. My breath hitched, and I froze. I swung the light from my headlamp in that direction. Nothing, only mist and stone. I rewound the camera playback, hands trembling. There it was, clear as anything. A figure, head bent slightly, shoulders slouched, like they'd been watching me the whole time. I spun in a slow circle, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. No sound, no movement, just the distant drip of water off leaves. I told myself it was the fog, maybe a shadow of a tree. But my throat had gone dry, and my skin prickled with the kind of fear you don't talk yourself out of. I should have left, but I didn't. I stayed, the lens shaking as I whispered, "Hello," into the silence. The woods gave nothing back. I kept filming, though my hands weren't steady. It was easier to look through the screen than into the fog itself. Something about the distance the camera gave me made it feel safer, though I knew it wasn't. The cemetery stretched deeper into the trees than I expected. Some of the stones had sunken almost flat into the soil, others had cracked clean through. At one point, I nearly tripped over what I thought was a root, but turned out to be the corner of a broken marker, buried like bone jutting from the ground. As I adjusted the focus, I noticed something else, small offerings left on some graves, a child's marble, smudged with dirt, a glass jar filled with cloudy water, and on one stone, a pair of shoes, weather-rotted but still upright, toes pointed toward the ridge, as if waiting for someone to step back into them. I felt watched, though every time I lifted my headlamp, there was only fog. My breath came shallow, and the silence felt too heavy, pressing against my ears. I stopped at a stone that was different, newer, not crumbled like the rest. The name had been carefully scratched in by hand. David, 1979, 1995. The lettering was uneven, jagged, like it had been carved with a pocket knife. No proper headstone, just a concrete slab. At its base was a spiral-bound notebook, swollen with damp. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The pages clung together, but I could still read pieces. He keeps coming back here, watching from the trees. I told her not to bury him up here. He won't stay down. The words blurred as water smeared the ink, but the shape of them lodged deep in my chest. When I lifted my head, I caught movement in the corner of the screen again. That figure, same slouched shoulders, same stillness, closer this time, near a cluster of stones. I turned fast, headlamp sweeping. Nothing. The beam cut through fog, glinted off wet stone, but there was no one. The ground felt unsteady beneath me. I don't even remember deciding to leave. I just started walking fast, then faster, until it was nearly a jog back down the ridge. The fog clung to me like hands, and I kept imagining footsteps just behind my own, measured, patient. When I finally burst into the clearing where my car was parked, the relief nearly dropped me to my knees. But as I reached for the door handle, I saw something on the back window, a handprint. Smudged, streaked with mud, dragged downward, as if someone had pressed their face close to the glass. The ride home was a blur. I didn't look in the mirrors. I didn't replay the footage until days later, when I finally worked up the nerve. What I saw still knots my stomach when I think about it. That figure, slouched, waiting, was there in more than one clip. Sometimes far off, barely visible through fog, other times closer, behind stones I'd just walked past. In one frame, my light swept over the grave with the shoes, and though I hadn't seen it then, the figure was standing right there, almost close enough to touch me. And the worst part, the notebook. I went back through the footage frame by frame. When I had opened it, the words weren't blurred by red, like I remembered. They were sharp. And the last line, written darker than the rest, clear as day, "Stop filming me." I don't film cemeteries anymore, but sometimes, when I set my camera on its tripod in my apartment, I swear I catch a slouched shadow in the corner of the frame. Always watching. Always waiting. I drove into Hollow Ridge, a nearly forgotten town tucked into the Appalachian Mountains, because I wanted to record the place where part of my family history had quietly rotted away. My grandmother used to mention a small family crypt up there, perched behind an old church no one attended anymore. She spoke of it rarely and never with fondness. Just brief mentions, almost reluctant, as though saying too much might stir something better left quiet. The last paved road gave way to mud and gravel. Rain had fallen that morning, and the air smelled like wet earth and cedar rot. The hills rose like dark, damp shoulders around me. The fog clung so tightly to the valleys that I could barely see 20 feet ahead. The old church finally appeared through it. Gray wood peeling, steeple leaning slightly, the windows boarded from the inside. The crypt was just beyond, on higher ground, half buried by wild grass and briars. It was smaller than I expected, no larger than a shed. Its stone was blotched with moss, the door a slab of rusting iron barely holding together. Recording gear hung heavy on my back, and I muttered into my phone's microphone, trying to narrate my impressions for later. The warped beams of the church, the stink of mildew, the silence that pressed harder the longer I stood still. Silence in the Appalachians isn't rare, but this was different. Normally, you hear crickets, wind in the trees, the distant knock of a woodpecker. Here, it was just absence. I walked around the crypt, boots sinking into wet leaves, flashlight sweeping across the ground. A few headstones leaned crookedly nearby, names eaten by lichen. One, however, was newer, too new. Its edges were sharp, the engraving still legible. Lydia Harrow, 1989, 2013. That stopped me. I didn't know the name, but the date struck me. I was 23 then, living states away. Who would have buried someone here, decades after the church shut down? Inside the church, the air was colder, sour with mold. My light found rows of collapsed pews, and a pulpit blackened by water damage. One detail snagged me, a lone shoe, tipped against the wall near the altar. A child's size, muddy, its laces stiff with age, no matching pair. I crouched to record it, and that was when I thought I heard something. Crunch, like gravel shifting outside. I froze, holding my breath. The crunch came again, closer this time, slow, measured. I turned off my mic and raised the flashlight, moving back toward the doorway. When I stepped into the yard, the fog seemed thicker, coiling low across the graves. The beam swept across stone and grass, catching nothing at first. Then it landed on something that jolted me upright. 2 bare feet. They stood no more than 15 feet away, pale against the mud, toes pressed into the dirt, as though whoever they belonged to had been standing there for some time. Before I could move, the light flicked just slightly, and in that fraction of a second, the feet were gone. I stood alone in the silence again, gripping the flashlight so hard my hand ached. My brain raced to explain it. Maybe a trick of the mist, a reflection, my nerves playing me, but the memory was too sharp. I had seen them. The recording still rancid in my pocket, capturing only the sound of my uneven breathing. I didn't speak for the rest of the night. I should have left then, but curiosity, or maybe stubbornness, kept me there. My grandmother used to say the Harrows were a family best forgotten. The name on that newer grave tied itself to those words in my head. I wanted proof of what lingered here, even if it only lived in records or carvings in stone. I circled the crypt again. The metal door was rusted but not locked. With a groan of hinges, it opened inward. The smell hit first. Damp stone, rot, something sweet and rancid underneath. I covered my nose with my sleeve and shined the light down. The interior was narrow, the walls lined with shallow recesses where remains might have rested. Most were empty, bones long removed, or never placed, except for one. On the far wall, a wooden box, no bigger than a child's coffin, sat on the slab. The wood was warped, darker at the edges with water damage. The lid had been pried at one corner, bent open, like someone tried to get inside but gave up. My hand shook as I leaned closer, light trembling across the surface. Carved into the wood, faint but visible, was the name again, Lydia. The air grew harder to breathe. My chest felt heavy, as though the walls pressed inward. That's when I heard it, another crunch. Not outside this time. Behind me. I spun the beam back toward the doorway. Nothing stood there. The fog lingered outside, unmoving. I took a step back anyway, heart hammering, whispering to myself to stay calm. But when the light crossed the floor, it landed on a set of prints, small, wet, bare feet. They led from the doorway, across the dirt floor of the crypt, stopping just short of the wooden box. I froze, staring at them until my vision blurred. I whispered out loud, though I didn't mean to. "This isn't possible." No answer, just that still, pressing silence. I backed out, fast. The beam jittered across the gravestones, the church, the mist. I couldn't stop glancing down, half expecting more prints to appear in the mud beside my own. When I finally reached the car, the world seemed normal again. Crickets hummed in the distance. A breeze stirred the trees. The oppressive silence was gone, but it didn't feel like a relief. It felt like I'd stepped out of something I shouldn't have entered. I drove away with the recorder still on, capturing the sound of gravel beneath my tires and my shallow, uneven breaths. I never told my family. I never asked about Lydia, or why she was buried there. And yet for weeks after, I kept playing that recording back, not for the sound of my breathing, but for something I almost wished I hadn't noticed. Between my gasps, faint but undeniable, another sound bled through. The slow crunch of footsteps, keeping pace with me as I left Hollow Ridge. I still can't explain it, and I don't listen to the recording anymore. I've never been the kind of person who seeks out creepy places, but in a town as small as Mill Branch, entertainment is scarce. Most nights end with cheap beer and bad decisions. That's how the dare happened. It was my friend Caleb's idea. We were parked off a gravel road, just outside the ridge where the old Whitlock Cemetery sits. He leaned against the hood of his truck, grinning in that way he always did when he thought he had the upper hand. "Bet you won't go inside the mausoleum with your camera," he said. The mausoleum he meant wasn't much. Stone walls stained green with moss, set back against the trees at the far end of the graveyard. Folks around here call it the vault. No one in town really tends to it anymore. The church it belonged to rotted down years ago. I laughed, though it came out thinner than I wanted. It's just a shed for bones. But the dare stuck, and when you've grown up in the Appalachians, your pride is sometimes the only thing you have to guard. So I grabbed my small video camera and flashlight, and trudged up the wet hill into the cemetery. The ground squished under my boots, heavy with last night's rain. Fog hung low in the hollows, pooling around tilted headstones and broken markers. The air smelled like wet iron and leaf rot. I found the mausoleum. It was smaller than I remembered, about the size of a single-room shack, but made entirely of stone. Its doorway framed by a heavy slab of granite fitted with rusting hinges. I swung the camera up, narrating in a low voice, mostly to prove to Caleb I wasn't rattled. "All right, entering the vault," I whispered. My voice sounded strange in the still air. Inside, the damp hit me first. The air was thick with mold and something sharper, like rust. My flashlight beam skimmed over names etched into marble, most of them so worn the letters bled into one another. A few slots in the walls still held coffins, their fronts sealed with cracked plaster. One had collapsed inward, revealing a sliver of wood rotting inside. I steadied the camera on each corner of the room, noting the way water streaked the stone, the faint drip 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 from somewhere above. It was quiet, too quiet. No bugs, no wind. My breath was the only sound, echoing strangely off the walls. I turned in a slow circle, panning the camera across the doorway behind me. The heavy granite slab stood exactly as it had when I walked in, barely cracked open, light from the outside filtering through. It looked so heavy, I doubted two men could move it easily. I stayed inside for maybe 5 minutes before nerves got the better of me. When I stepped out, the fog had thickened. Caleb's figure was just a shadow down the hill, his laughter carrying faintly through the mist. Later that night, back in my room, I loaded the footage onto my laptop. I expected it to be boring, just shaky flashlight pans over stone and shadows. But then I saw it. When the camera turned back toward the doorway, the granite slab began to move. It was slow at first, almost imperceptible. But second by second, frame by frame, it closed, sealing off the light, until the crack vanished completely. Yet in my memory, standing inside that mausoleum, the door had never moved. I had walked out without pushing or pulling anything. The footage ended with me still inside, the camera drifting across the walls, but the doorway, on screen, was sealed shut. I replayed it 3 times, each slower than the last, until the sick feeling in my stomach forced me to stop. I couldn't explain it, and worse, I couldn't shake the sense that something about that stone room hadn't been empty after all. I told myself it was just the angle, the way the light caught. Maybe the camera shook and made it look like movement. I clung to that thought for 2 days, but it didn't hold. The footage burned in my head. So I went back. This time, I didn't tell Caleb. I parked at the edge of the cemetery, just before dusk. The air was colder, the fog thicker, and the smell of damp stone even stronger. My boots slid in the mud as I climbed the hill. The mausoleum loomed ahead, darker than the headstones around it. The slab door stood open, just as before. Inside, the smell had worsened, stronger mold, sharper rust. My flashlight beam landed on something I hadn't noticed last time. On the floor, near the far wall, a small object sat half buried in dirt. I crouched down. It was a cassette tape, its label smeared with water damage, but still faintly legible. Whitlock Service 1991. The tape felt swollen with moisture, but intact. I slipped it into my pocket, unease growing with every second I lingered. That's when I noticed something else. The slab door. From where I stood now, I could see faint drag marks in the mud, starting just inside the entrance and running several inches forward, like the door had scraped across the floor. I left fast, cassette burning a hole in my pocket. Back home, I dug out an old tape player from my father's boxes. The gears whined, the tape clicked, and a voice crackled through the static. Interment of Lydia Whitlock, family only. Then faintly, muffled voices in the background. A woman sobbing, a man murmuring something I couldn't make out. But then came another sound, louder, clearer, the heavy grind of stone. The door, it closed on the tape the same way it had on my footage, slow and deliberate. The priest's voice faltered, and the recording ended in sudden silence. I shut it off, hands trembling. I've never gone back to the Whitlock Cemetery. I avoid that road entirely now, but the tape sits in my desk drawer, and the footage still lingers on my hard drive. Sometimes I think about deleting them both, but then I imagine sitting inside that mausoleum again, hearing stone scrape shut, and realizing I might not get out this time. And that fear keeps me from touching either one, because if the footage is right, if the tape is right, that door didn't just close once, it always closes. I've always had this habit of live streaming when I go on my little drives through the Appalachians. It started as a way to keep myself company on long, lonely nights, then grew into something bigger. People liked the mood, the winding roads, the mist sliding off the ridges, the sound of my boots on wet leaves. I wasn't famous or anything, but a few hundred people tuned in whenever I streamed. That was enough. It was late September, the air damp and sweet with rot. The mountains here held on to summer longer than most places, but already the smell of wet leaves carried that faint warning of winter. I'd parked near a cemetery off a back road outside of Glen Haven, a town you won't find on most maps. I'd been driving past it for years, but I'd never stopped until that night. Something about the way the fog hugged the fence caught my eye. It wasn't a big place, just a dozen headstones on a hillside, with a stone wall sagging in places and an old iron gate half buried in weeds. I thought it would be good content for the stream. Cemeteries always draw people in. I turned on my phone light, adjusted the little tripod on my backpack, and let the stream roll. My breath came out in pale clouds. The chat filled with the usual mix of teasing comments and nervous jokes. Bros about to get dragged by a ghost. Spooky vibes. Where is this? Looks like Blair Witch. I laughed, tried to keep it light, but the truth was, the place unsettled me. The headstones leaned at odd angles, some half swallowed by the hillside. Moss covered everything. The silence was deep, too deep. Even the insects were quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. My boots sank into mud as I walked along the row of markers, reading names so worn they were almost gone. Families buried together. Infants who hadn't lived past a month. The chat started to pick up. Wait, what's behind you? Left side of screen. Bro, no joke. There's someone there. I froze, spun around with my phone raised high. My light only showed fog and trees. The ground fell away to a shallow slope that ended in tangled brush. No movement, no sound. I told myself it was shadows, or maybe the compression on the live stream glitching, but the comments kept coming. She's wearing white. Behind him again. Don't you see? Yo, this is crazy. I forced a laugh, but my throat felt tight. You guys are messing with me, I said, my voice sounding thinner than I liked. I lingered another few minutes, filmed some close-ups of the stones, then signed off. My phone battery was nearly dead, and I told myself I was just feeding into their hype. Still, I walked quickly back to the car. My boots slapped wet pavement. When I shut the door, the slam echoed too loud in the night. I didn't look back at the cemetery. It wasn't until I got home and replayed the stream that my stomach dropped. About 15 minutes in, right as I turned away from the slope, you could see it. A pale outline, faint but there, walking slowly across the screen. The shape was wrong for fog. It was a person. A woman, maybe, though the face never showed. She moved behind me, in and out of the mist, then dissolved into nothing before she reached the edge of the frame. I rewound it again and again. My chest went hollow. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe it was nothing. But the more I watched, the more I hated the way her form seemed deliberate, like she was watching me, and only me. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in the house sounded like footsteps on wet grass. I kept checking the replay until my eyes ached, and each time it felt less like I was watching her, and more like she was watching me. I told myself I wasn't going back, but 3 days later I drove out to Glen Haven again. Something about that cemetery gnawed at me. I wanted proof it was just a trick of the light, that I wasn't losing it. The road was slick from rain, the valleys below thick with fog. My tires hissed on the wet pavement. It was the kind of weather where sound travels strangely. You hear things that aren't there, or think you do. When I pulled up near the cemetery, the fence looked smaller, weaker than I remembered. The fog made the trees seem like walls pressing in. I didn't start the stream this time. My phone stayed in my pocket. I just wanted to see it for myself. The gate groaned when I pushed it open. The air smelled like iron and wet stone. I walked the same line of graves, mud sucking at my boots. The silence was unbearable. It felt like even the mountains were waiting. Near the back, I noticed something I hadn't before, an old wooden bench, half rotted and leaning against a maple tree. A pile of sodden fabric lay crumpled at its base. At first I thought it was a blanket, but when I nudged it with my boot, I realized it was a dress. White, or it had been once. Now it was stained brown and green, eaten through by mildew. The sleeves were torn. The smell was sour, like wet earth and mold. My throat closed. I bent down, careful not to touch it, and saw that the fabric was still heavy with moisture, like it had only recently been pulled from the ground. The mud underneath was fresh. Suddenly, I didn't want to be there anymore. I backed away, my pulse hammering, and nearly tripped over a flat stone marker. The name carved into it was gone, just a smooth slab now, but someone had left fresh flowers on top. Wild flowers, arranged neatly, though they were already wilted. There was no house nearby, no sign of anyone tending this place. The road outside was empty when I'd parked, yet someone had been here. Recently. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there staring at the cemetery gate, swallowed in fog. My reflection in the rear view looked pale and hollow. When I finally got home, I opened the live stream replay one more time. I don't know why. I'd promised myself I wouldn't. But I couldn't resist. I let the footage play until the moment she appeared. The pale figure, walking behind me, dissolving into mist. Only this time, something new caught my eye. Right before she vanished, her head turned. Just slightly, enough for the camera to catch the curve of her face. And in that blur of pixels, I swear she was looking straight at the lens, not at me, but at the people watching. At them. At you. I shut the laptop and sat in silence for a long time. I haven't streamed since. The dress, the flowers, the way she turned. None of it makes sense. And maybe that's worse than if it did, because it means there are pieces I'll never put together. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the mountains outside are drowned in fog, I imagine the viewers still replaying that stream, watching her take those steps, watching her turn. And I wonder if, somewhere up there, She's still walking. I grew up in the Appalachian foothills, in a county most folks don't bother visiting unless they're lost or hunting for antiques. The place has a way of hanging on to you, thick with fog in the mornings, streams that smell of rust, and roads that twist like they were laid by someone drunk. After moving away for college, I found myself coming back more often than I expected. Not for family, not even really for nostalgia. It was the quiet, the kind that pressed into your ears until you thought you could hear your own blood moving. Last fall, I decided to film some night vision footage in the old graveyard outside of Maple Hollow. It wasn't for anything serious, just one of those personal projects that feel important at the time. I'd picked the children's section of the cemetery. The stones there were small, many tilting or half swallowed by moss. The air always seemed heavier in that corner, like the valley itself was reluctant to let go of the sound of children who'd once played there. The cabin I rented sat about a mile down the road from the cemetery. It was one of those hunting lodges no one maintained anymore. Sagging roof, damp walls, and a smell of wet wood that clung to my clothes. The floorboards gave under each step, and the furniture felt wrong, as if it had been arranged and rearranged too many times. There was a child's chair tucked into the corner of the kitchen. No kids had been in that house for decades, but the chair was set at the table like someone had eaten there recently. The first night, I carried my gear into the graveyard. The fog was thick enough that my flashlight couldn't cut more than a few yards. My camera, with the night vision setting, picked up details my eyes couldn't, rows of leaning stones, vines crawling over names I couldn't make out. I remember adjusting the focus when I caught a sound, a giggle, high and quick right beside me. I froze. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't the wind either. I lowered the camera, but there was nothing, just the fog pressing closer, making everything damp. When I played the footage back on the small screen, my stomach tightened. A small shadow, low to the ground, quick, darted across the path in front of me. I swear it was shaped like a child, but the more I replayed it, the less I trusted what I was seeing. My ears filled with that silence afterward, heavy enough that I caught myself holding my breath. Back at the cabin, I set the camera on the table and stared at the footage again. The giggle wasn't there, just static, like the microphone had gone dead for those few seconds. The shadow was still visible, but not as clear as I remembered. I rewound it until my eyes burned, convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon, maybe my own shadow warping through the mist. Still, I couldn't shake it. The cabin creaked in the night, and every sound seemed sharper. Water dripping somewhere in the bathroom, the scratching of branches against the tin roof. At one point, around 3 a.m., I swore I heard something shift in the kitchen. When I checked, the child's chair had been moved slightly away from the table. I told myself I must have brushed it earlier without realizing. But the air in that room was colder than the rest of the house, and I couldn't make myself sit in the chair to test its balance. I just went back to bed, staring at the ceiling until morning light crept in gray and thin. That was the first night I started doubting my memory. The second night, I returned to the cemetery. I told myself I wanted better footage, clearer evidence. The truth was, I just needed to prove I wasn't losing my mind. The fog rolled in thicker than before, and the woods surrounding the graveyard sounded alive, rustling, cracking, the occasional thud of something moving just out of sight. I walked to the children's section, setting the camera low on a tripod. I let it record while I stood back. The air smelled like wet leaves and faint rot, the kind that clings after days of rain. The silence stretched, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig. Then again, a laugh, quick, too close. I swung around with the flashlight. Nothing. But when I turned back to the camera, the red recording light was off. I hadn't touched it. Back at the cabin, I plugged the camera into my laptop. The file had saved, but the footage made no sense. The frame shook, even though the tripod was steady. For about 30 seconds, the angle tilted toward the trees, and just before the feed cut out, I saw something that made my throat tighten. A row of small stones, lined up in the grass, not grave markers, but river stones, each one smudged dark, almost like with ash. They hadn't been there when I set the camera up. I paused the footage and checked the timestamp. The exact moment the stones appeared was the same second I heard the laugh. That night, the cabin felt unlivable. I lay awake, listening to the creak of the walls and the whistle of wind slipping through cracks. Sometime after midnight, I got up for water. When I walked into the kitchen, my foot struck something on the floor. It was a river stone, damp, smudged with the same dark stain I'd seen in the video. The child's chair was pulled far away from the table now, as though someone had been sitting there and suddenly pushed back. I didn't sleep again. I sat on the couch until the window lightened with dawn, staring at that stone on the floor. My hands shaking so badly, I couldn't hold a mug. I left the cabin that morning, didn't bother cleaning up or checking out. I just drove the winding mountain road until the fog thinned and the air stopped feeling heavy. It's been months since then. I still have the footage, though I can't bring myself to watch it anymore. The stone sits in a shoebox under my bed. Sometimes at night, I wake to the sound of something small shifting against the wood of that box. And every so often, when I'm half asleep, I swear I hear that same giggle. High and sharp, close enough to feel the breath of it against my ear. I don't tell anyone about it. I know how it sounds, but I carry it with me now, like the valley itself didn't let me leave empty-handed. I've always been drawn to storms. There's something about the way the sky splits open, the world flickering in and out of shadow, that makes me feel alive. That night, I had my camera slung over my shoulder and a tripod under my arm, determined to catch some lightning rolling over the mountains. The place I chose wasn't exactly welcoming. Just off a wet gravel road outside of a hollow near Burnsville, there was an old cemetery. I'd driven past it plenty of times. The iron gate leaned inward like it had given up, and the fence was more rust than metal. Most of the gravestones leaned at angles, some swallowed halfway into the mud. From the road it looked forgotten, but that's what made it perfect for the kind of footage I wanted. Empty hills, cracked marble, and a backdrop of storm clouds. By the time I parked, the rain had already turned the dirt into a swamp. I stepped over the gate rather than trying to open it. The hinges groaned when I brushed them. The air smelled of wet moss and rust, thick enough to taste. Every sound carried in the valley, the click of my tripod, the suck of mud against my boots, even my own breath. I set the camera near the center, where the graves spread across a slope. Lightning started breaking through the clouds in quick bursts, and each time it did, the headstones and wrought iron crosses jumped out of the dark like white teeth. The first few minutes felt ordinary. I fiddled with settings, framed the hills, adjusted the focus. Then came a longer flash. For a split second, I thought I saw movement. It wasn't an animal too upright. My stomach tightened. When the thunder rolled away, I glanced up from the screen. Nothing but rain, wind pushing through the trees. But when the next flash hit, I caught it again. This time, in the far corner of the cemetery, 3 shapes stood among the graves. I froze. I told myself they were trees, or maybe the shadows of crosses I hadn't noticed. But something felt wrong. They weren't in the same places I remembered from before. The rain came harder, rattling through the leaves. I kept filming, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the camera was catching something my eyes weren't. Every time the lightning lit up the hill, there seemed to be more of them. Not moving, not clear. Just dark outlines where there should have been nothing. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe the storm was messing with my vision. Maybe the lens was catching water. Still, when I finally packed up, my hands shook. I left the tripod wet, mud coating my jeans. As I climbed back into my car, I felt something, a pressure, like the air itself had thickened. I told myself I'd check the footage in the morning. But that night, as I sat in the driver's seat, rain sliding down the windshield, I couldn't help glancing back at the gate. For the briefest second, I thought I saw someone standing just behind it. By the time I blinked, the gate was empty. I didn't sleep much. Every time thunder cracked, I thought I heard voices under it, low and muffled. By morning, I told myself exhaustion was making me imagine things. I opened my laptop, slid the memory card in, and hit play. At first, it was nothing special. Mud, stone markers, lightning carving the sky open. Then came the long flash I remembered. My heart sank as I watched the silhouettes bloom out of the dark like stains on the frame. They weren't trees, they weren't crosses, they were human in shape. Their outlines jagged as if the storm had burned them into the film. I scrubbed forward. Each flash revealed more of them, scattered across the hill, some tall, some hunched, some barely more than children. And yet none of them moved. They just appeared, then disappeared, always in different places. I leaned closer to the screen. One figure near the foreground caught my eye. The way its head tilted, slightly off-center. The longer I stared, the more I was sure it was facing directly toward the camera. I told myself to stop, that it was shadows, water, tricks of light. But the footage kept pulling me in. At one point, just before a cut of thunder, the lens caught something impossible to explain. Two figures side by side, their shoulders almost touching, both facing forward, like they'd been waiting. Their outlines were clearer than before, their posture too deliberate. I paused the video. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. It should have ended there. I should have deleted the footage. But curiosity is its own kind of sickness. That evening, when the rain returned, I drove back. The road was slick, the hillside shining under the headlights. When I reached the cemetery, the gate was hanging wider than before, though I knew I'd left it shut. The mud inside was layered with footprints. Dozens of them, some deep, some shallow, weaving between graves. Too many for one night. I tried to tell myself people had been there before me. Kids, maybe, vandals. But the longer I stood, the less sense it meant. The tracks went in circles, overlapping each other. Some stopped abruptly, mid-step, like whoever made them had simply vanished. I didn't stay long. Every sound carried differently in the storm. Rain falling, wind scraping across the stones, branches bending under the weight. But beneath it all was something softer, breathing, maybe, or whispers so low they almost matched the rent. I left my gear behind that night. Just ran to the car and drove until I reached the highway. Even then, I kept checking the rear view mirror, waiting for shapes that never appeared. It's been weeks since then. I haven't gone back, though. Sometimes I wake up and think I hear the gate creaking open outside my window. I've watched the footage too many times. Each time, I notice new outlines I swear weren't there before. Faces buried in the step, shapes at the edge of the front. Leaning closer, the worst part isn't the cemetery, though. It's the final clip. The one I don't remember filming. Just 10 seconds, taken from inside my car. On the windshield, the gate in the distance, and a single figure standing in the middle of the road, head tilted, waiting. I never saw it that night, but it's there on the video, clear as day, and every time I drive those mountain roads now, every bend feels like it's leading me back there. I've always had a bad habit of poking around places that most people in town avoid. Old barns, dried up coal shafts, sagging farmhouses left to rot in the hollers. Those places always seemed to draw me in. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was boredom. I never really figured out which. That's what led me and two friends, Josh and Emily, to the cemetery above McCreary Hollow. It sat on the side of the ridge, a 19th century graveyard for miners and their families, most of whom had been gone for over 100 years. The road up was a rutted strip of clay, washed out in spots by last week's rain. By the time we reached the gate, fog was pooling low between the crooked stones. You couldn't see 10 feet in front of you without it folding back in again. The iron arch over the entrance still had a name welded to it, but the rust had eaten through most of the letters. All I could make out was Erie, the The rest flaked off into orange dust when I ran my fingers across it. Inside, the place was half swallowed by the woods. White oak roots had heaved up the ground, cracking open graves that were never reinforced. Some stones leaned at impossible angles. Others lay flat and sinking into the dirt. The air smelled of wet leaves, rot, and old iron. I'd brought along a small handheld recorder. It wasn't anything fancy, just something I used when hiking to catch bird calls or note trail markers. But that day I thought it might be interesting to let it run while we explored. Emily was the first to mention how quiet it felt. "Where are the crickets?" she asked. She was right. No cicadas, no frogs, not even the whippoorwills you usually hear in the evenings up here. Just the occasional creak of branches shifting in the fog. Josh tried to laugh it off. "Guess even bugs don't want to be buried here." But his voice carried strangely, flat, like the air had swallowed the sound. We split off, each wandering between the stones. I remember brushing moss off a marker dated 1863, the inscription nearly gone. I found fragments of glass, maybe an old oil lamp, buried in the mud. At the far end, a tree had grown around a wrought iron fence, swallowing the bars until they looked like bones under skin. But it was the center of the cemetery that caught my attention. There was a large stone, wider than the rest, almost like a table. Someone had laid a child's toy there, a faded plastic horse with one leg missing. It couldn't have been there long. The rain would have ruined it, but the plastic was clean, like it had been placed just recently. I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't terrifying, not yet, but it didn't make sense. None of us had brought it. The town was miles down the ridge. Who else would come all the way up here? When we regrouped at the gate, nobody mentioned the toy. I didn't bring it up either. We just left. The recorder was still running in my pocket. Later that night, sitting in my apartment, I uploaded the files to my laptop. At first it was what you'd expect. Our footsteps in mud, a few muffled laughs, Emily saying she couldn't read the names on the stones. Then static, long stretches of nothing. But around the 30-minute mark, something slipped through the quiet. It was faint, buried under the hum of wind. At first it sounded like a sigh. Then, as I replayed it, slowing it down, the noise sharpened into something else, a whisper. And then, clear as if someone had leaned close to the microphone, I heard it. My name. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself it was a trick of the wind, a glitch in the recorder. But no matter how many times I replayed it, the sound was the same, drawn out, deliberate, and in a voice that wasn't mine, Josh's or Emily's. The next morning, I asked them about it. Over coffee at the diner, I played the clip. Josh frowned, said he couldn't make it out. Emily put down her spoon, pale. "That's your name," she whispered. We sat there in silence. Neither of them admitted to saying it, and I believed them. The days after, little things began to nag. At night, when my apartment went still, I'd hear the faint hiss of static, even without the recorder on. My own breath seemed too loud, like the silence was pressing against it. I started waking up at 3:17 every morning, staring at the ceiling, convinced I wasn't alone. A week later, against my better judgment, I went back up the ridge, alone this time. I needed proof, something to convince me it wasn't just in my head. The cemetery looked the same, but emptier somehow. The fog was heavier, draped between the stones. The toy horse was still there, though the plastic had cracked from the sun. I walked slow, careful not to disturb anything. Every step felt too loud. I stopped at the big stone in the center. My fingers brushed across the surface. It was cold, damp, almost sticky with moss. That's when I saw it, carved faintly into the edge of the stone. Letters, uneven and shallow, like someone had scratched them with a nail or a pocket knife. Not a name, not a date, just 3 words. "We hear you." I backed away, recorder clutched tight in my hand, though I hadn't even turned it on. My chest felt tight, like the fog itself was pressing in. The sound that followed wasn't loud, but it froze me where I stood. Leaves shifting, footsteps maybe, slow and deliberate, moving between the stones. I spun around, but the fog was too thick. Nothing there. I didn't wait. I bolted down the hill, sliding in mud, branches clawing my arms. When I finally reached the gravel road, I realized I'd dropped the recorder. I didn't go back for it. That was months ago. I haven't told Josh or Emily about the words carved into the stone. I don't think they'd believe me. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear it again. The faint hiss, the whisper, my own name, threaded through static. And the worst part is, I can't tell if it's coming from outside the apartment or from inside me. I bought the drone on a whim, not because I needed it, but because I was restless. The kind of restless that makes you spend money just to distract yourself. After my dad passed the year before, I'd been driving through the back roads of western North Carolina, tracing towns he used to talk about from his childhood. It felt like walking into a version of America that hadn't moved on. Shuttered storefronts, hand-painted signs, and valleys where the fog rolled in like smoke from a damp fire. That's how I found myself outside of Ridge Hollow Cemetery one Sunday morning. It wasn't marked on any map I had, just a crooked iron gate with no lock and a gravel pull-off barely big enough for my truck. The place sat on the slope of a ridge, ringed by black locust trees and heavy moss. There was no church in sight, no houses nearby, just graves scattered across the hillside like crooked teeth. I didn't walk around much at first. I just launched the drone. The controls were still new to me, and flying it over the uneven ground seemed safer than stumbling around. From the ground, the cemetery looked small, but from above, it stretched further into the woods than I expected. Rows of tilted headstones, many half buried under creeping ivy. The air smelled of wet leaves and rust. My boots sank slightly into the ground, the soil soft with last night's rain. I heard crows, distant, then nothing at all. That kind of silence only the mountains carry. It wasn't until I sat back in my truck and replayed the footage that I noticed it. At first, it looked like a shadow, a blur moving between two stones near the tree line. I scrubbed the footage back and leaned in close. My stomach tightened when I saw it clearly, a figure crawling, not walking, not kneeling. Crawling low to the ground on all fours, moving deliberately from one headstone to the next. The arms and legs bent oddly, like whoever it was trying to keep their profile hidden, as if they didn't want to be seen. I froze, staring at the screen, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. A trick of the drone camera. A dog, maybe, but no dog moves like that. I hadn't seen anyone in the cemetery while I stood there. Not a soul. The place had looked empty. Still, I played it back again. The figure's shirt, or skin, was pale against the darker ground. The movement was slow, cautious, methodical. The thought settled in my chest like a weight. Someone had been there, close enough to see me, close enough to hear me, while I had no idea they were there at all. I drove back down the mountain roads faster than I should have, gravel spitting from my tires. The drone still buzzing in my head. The footage didn't explain anything, but it left me with a question I couldn't shake. Who crawls through a cemetery like that? And why didn't they want to be seen? That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the pale figure sliding between the stones, head low, arms bent wrong, moving with purpose I couldn't understand. And for reasons I can't fully explain, I knew I had to go back. 2 days later, I returned. The mountain roads were slick with rain, fog sitting low enough to blur the valley. The cemetery looked smaller again in person, but no less strange. The iron gate groaned when I pushed it open, as though resenting me. I told myself I was only there to prove nothing was wrong, that the footage had been a fluke, an illusion. Still, I brought the drone, though I left it in the truck for a while, and walked the grounds on foot instead. The graves were old, most from the early 1900s, some just carved rocks with initials. A few had offerings left, coins, wilted flowers, even a child's shoe hard with rot. I moved slowly, scanning the ground where I thought I'd seen the figure. The wet grass pressed flat in some places, though that could have been deer. The smell of earth and mold clung to everything. Then I saw it. Near the tree line, between two leaning stones, a patch of mud was darker than the rest, disturbed as if someone had knelt there recently. Beside it, the ground bore the shape of a handprint pressed deep, fingers splayed. The soil still glistened like it hadn't had time to dry. I stood there for a long time, barely breathing. The woods beyond the graves were silent, as though holding something in. I finally turned back toward the truck, convincing myself I'd seen enough, when something caught my eye near one of the larger monuments. A small wooden box rested against the base, weathered by rain, but clearly placed there. I hesitated before picking it up. It was lighter than unexpected, almost empty. Inside, wrapped in a piece of stained cloth, was an old photograph. It showed 3 people, a man, a woman, and a boy no older than 10. Their faces weren't smiling, just staring straight at the camera. Behind them, unmistakable, was the Ridge Hollow Cemetery, the same tilted stones I stood among now. The back of the photo was smeared with dirt, but I could still make out writing, 1974. The unease that hit me then wasn't sharp, but heavy, like something slotting down into my stomach and standing there. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but the fact that the photo had been hidden, wrapped, left there, it felt intentional. As I tucked the photo back into the cloth, I noticed movement in the corner of my eye, between the graves, low to the ground. My body locked. When I looked directly, there was nothing, just rain dripping from branches, fog curling between stones. I didn't run. I walked, careful, steady, forcing myself not to look back until I reached the truck. That night, I replayed the drone footage again. I zoomed in closer than before, frame by frame, and this time I noticed something I hadn't the first time. The figure crawling between the graves had stopped once, just stopped, head tilted upward, not toward the trees, toward the camera, toward me. I haven't gone back since, but I keep the photo in a drawer, and sometimes I take it out, not because I want to, but because I can't help it. The faces in it never look any different. The men, the woman, the boy, none of them crawling, none of them hidden. But when I stare too long, I can't shake the feeling that one day, I'll see that pale figure again. Not in the footage, not in the photo, but in the corner of my eye, low to the ground, moving slow. I've always been fascinated with places most people avoid. Maybe it's because I grew up in the shadow of the Blue Ridge, where abandoned coal towns and forgotten graveyards are as common as gas stations. This trip started out simple enough. Just me, a borrowed cabin on the edge of Clay County, and a week of quiet with my thermal camera. I'd been testing it out for a side project, a sort of amateur documentary about Appalachian history. The cabin was older than I'd imagined when I first pulled up. The roof sagged under decades of weather, and the wood siding peeled in gray flakes. It smelled faintly of mildew inside, with a heavier undertone, like wet earth and old tobacco. Every step on the floorboards made the nails whine in protest. I wasn't bothered. If anything, I liked the way the place seemed frozen in time. That first evening, I walked the gravel road leading toward the woods. The air hung damp and heavy, the kind that makes fog cling low across the ground. Just down the slope, half hidden in knotweed, I found what looked like a tiny family graveyard. No more than a dozen headstones, most leaning at awkward angles. The names were worn smooth by years of rain, though a few dates were still legible, early 1900s, mostly. It wasn't the first graveyard I'd stumbled across in the mountains. What caught my attention was how secluded it was, boxed in by poplar trees and bramble, as if the forest had grown deliberately to hide it. Later that night, after the wind picked up and the trees groaned against each other, I returned with the thermal camera. The grave markers glowed faintly blue in the screen, the same cold temperature as the night air. My breath appeared in bursts of orange, but as I swept the lens across the row of graves, one spot made me pause. The third headstone from the right, short, cracked down the middle. The ground in front of it burned with heat on the display, glowing a solid orange-red like a fresh coal bed. I blinked, lowered the camera, then looked back with my own eyes. Nothing unusual. The dirt was undisturbed, covered in moss and dead leaves. No mounding or sinking. No sign anyone had touched it in decades. But when I lifted the thermal lens again, the heat shimmered clearly in the soil, as if a body, alive and warm, was stretched out 6 feet below. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to reason it away. Maybe the stone retained heat differently. Maybe an animal burrowed beneath. But the glow held a human shape, stretched out in the unmistakable outline of someone lying flat. The longer I stared, the more unsettled I became. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing damp against my skin. I glanced back at the cabin, its windows like black, watching eyes, and for the first time that trip, I felt unwelcome. Still, curiosity won out. I marked the headstone in my notebook, just a rough sketch of its placement, and forced myself to head back. Inside, I locked the cabin door, though I wasn't sure why. The silence deepened around me, broken only by the ticking of the old wall clock. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that glowing grave on the camera screen, radiating warmth where there should have been nothing but cold, dead earth. The next morning brought rain. It fell steady and gray, sliding down the cabin windows in long streaks. The air inside smelled heavier, like damp rot now, and I noticed condensation gathering on the window frames. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself I'd misread the thermal image, that the equipment was faulty, but the thought gnawed at me. By afternoon, the rain slowed, and mist clung to the valley. I grabbed the camera and made my way back to the graveyard. The forest was hushed in that wet, muffled way it gets after a storm. When I reached the headstones, I felt an odd pressure in my chest, like the air was denser here. I powered on the camera. Every grave appeared in the same dull blue haze, except the sin one. It still pulsed with warmth, the outline sharper than before. I could see the curve of what looked like a shoulder, the bend of knees. A gust of wet wind rustled through the poplars, and for a moment, I thought I smelled something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. My stomach turned. I backed away, but not far enough. Kneeling down, I brushed leaves away from the base of the headstone. Beneath the moss, I uncovered faint letters carved deep into the rock. I couldn't make out the name, but the date was clear. 1987, far more recent than the others. I snapped a photo, though my hand shook. The ground was undisturbed. Yes, but the heat radiating through the soil didn't lie. Something was alive, or had been recently, beneath that dirt. I left in a hurry, boots sucking at the mud as I made my way uphill. Back inside the cabin, I replayed the footage on my laptop, frame after frame. The grave burned like a coal bed. I zoomed in, convinced I might see movement. At one point, I swore I saw the faintest shift in the outline, like the curve of a chest rising. The rain picked up again that evening, hammering the tin roof. I sat alone in the cabin with every lens on, the thermal camera set on the table beside me. I didn't go back to the graveyard after that. I couldn't, but the image never left me. Even now, months later, I see it whenever I close my eyes. The glowing outline of a body in a grave that should have been cold. I think about the date, 1987. Someone buried there was younger than me when they died. And I wonder if it was ever really a grave at all, or something else entirely. The camera is packed away in a box in my closet, but I can't bring myself to get rid of it. Sometimes I wake at night, sweating, convinced I hear rain against the windows even when the sky is clear. And every time I think about that heat signature, pulsing faintly beneath the soil in a forgotten Appalachian cemetery, as if someone down there was still breathing, waiting. I never planned on staying in Damascus longer than a couple of nights. I was just passing through on my way south, following the Appalachian Trail down into Tennessee. I'd been filming short videos of my hikes, just little clips to send my sister, proof that I was still alive and moving. One afternoon, I wandered off the main trail, cutting down a muddy path toward a cemetery I'd seen marked on an old map. It wasn't even on my GPS. The map called it St. Agnes Burial Ground. But when I got there wasn't much left of it. Just a slope of grass with a crooked wire fence and maybe 24 headstones, most leaning or broken. The ground was soft from last night's rain, and the fog was hanging low over the valley, filling the hollows like water in a bowl. The silence out there was heavy. No wind, no bird song, just the occasional drip of rain from the branches. I set my phone against a rock and recorded myself talking about the town, the fog, the trail ahead. Just filler footage. Nothing happened. It wasn't until 2 nights later, holed up in a cheap motel drying out my gear, that I noticed something while editing. In the corner of one of the clips, near the edge of the frame, there was a face. It was pale, pressed right up against the trunk of a tree. The eyes were wide open, staring directly at me, and the mouth seemed to sag slightly, like the weight of it was pulling the whole face downward. I froze the video, zoomed in. The figure wasn't moving, no color in the skin. At first I thought it was just bark or moss that happened to look like a face, but the longer I stared, the less it looked like pareidolia. It looked like someone had been standing there, someone who hadn't made a sound. The memory of that silence came rushing back. No twigs snapping, no footsteps, nothing. The next morning, against my better judgment, I hiked back out there. The fog had lifted, but the ground was still damp and soft. I found the same tree easily. It was larger than the others, its trunk dark with rot at the base, and there, running straight down the bark, were scratches, not animal marks, not clean cuts from a blade. They were ragged, uneven gouges, dug deep like someone had raked their fingernails down the tree until they broke. I pressed my palm against one of the grooves, and it fit almost too well. I stood there a long time, waiting for some sound, some sign of another person, but the woods stayed hushed. My ears rang with the absence of anything living. That night, I didn't sleep well. The motel room stank faintly of mildew, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face against the tree, still, silent, watching. I told myself I should just keep moving. Towns like this held too many empty buildings, too many places for thoughts to get lost. But instead of pressing on, I lingered. The next morning I walked into the local library, an old brick building that smelled of wet paper and dust. I asked the librarian if she'd heard of St. Agnes Burial Ground. She frowned, thought for a moment, and said, "That's been closed up near 50 years. Flood washed out most of the graves." She said it so plainly, as if it were no more unusual than a road closure. When I asked if people still visited, her face shifted, like she wanted to say something but didn't. Finally, she just said, "Best not to linger out that way." I should have let it go, but instead I went back again. The second visit felt worse. The air was different, heavier, as if the whole hollow was holding its breath. I stood at the edge of the cemetery, camera in hand, but couldn't bring myself to hit record. The graves looked smaller than I remembered. The fence sagged lower, the grass was wet, the soil soft enough to sink my boots an inch with every step. When I reached the tree, I noticed something I'd missed before. The bark around the scratches was darker, almost greasy, as if sweat or oil had seeped into the wood. I leaned in closer and saw, caught in one of the grooves, the pale crescent of a fingernail, broken clean off. The sight made my stomach flip. I backed away, scanning the trees, waiting for movement. There was none, just the weight of silence pressing down. I don't know why I stayed as long as I did. Maybe part of me thought if I waited, I'd see the face again, and finally prove it was real. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt exposed, like I wasn't just in the woods, but inside something that was watching me. I left in a rush, stumbling back through the wet grass until I reached the road. That night, I watched the video again, frame by frame. The face was still there, still pressed against the tree, but now that I'd been back, it felt different. The image didn't look like a stranger anymore. The set of the mouth, the narrow jawline, it looked familiar. It looked like me. I closed the laptop and shoved it away, but the thought wouldn't leave. Had I really seen someone, or had I filmed myself from some strange angle I couldn't explain? The scratches, the fingernail, the silence. What if none of it was what I thought? It's been months since I left Damascus, but I still can't sleep through the night. Every time I wake up, I feel the same damp air in my lungs, the same hush of those woods, and when I catch my reflection in a dark window, for half a second, it feels like I'm back at that tree, pressed up close, watching myself.